Coming off of the previous novels that I've read, all of which have been small, contained stories, it definitely took me a while to adjust to this book's galaxy-spanning story. The stakes are higher, there are a lot more characters, and multiple storylines happening all at once. As a reader, I didn't get as much character development and insight as I was hoping for, but I got enough for the characters that it mattered for, like Ochi and Rey's parents. It was also hard for me to care about a lot of the brand new characters because of how many there were and how quickly they came in and out of the story. Other than those like Luke, Lando, Ochi, and Rey's parents, which existed before the book, no one else really grabbed my attention and made me want to know more. The book was also excessively full of description, which made the story feel too long and dragged out. I personally didn't enjoy that specific style of writing, but others may like that style more than me. I thought that the action was also written fairly inconsistent, with it sometimes grabbing my attention and engaging me in the battle, and other times it dragged on, turning a short fight into an excessively long and descriptive scene. Like I said before, some other readers may enjoy that way of writing action sequences, but I personally was not a fan of it. Because I was using the audiobook with the physical copy, the music did help some of the time, but it still wasn't enough to make it consistently work for me. The story itself was also hard to care about sometimes, because I already knew how most of the storylines ended, so the stakes never felt that high. When this book begins, the reader is immediately introduced to Rey and her parents, Dathan and Miramir. I quickly became attached to her mother, but it took much longer for her father. Sometimes I was drawn to the character, and other times his dialogue and inner thoughts seemed to spew on forever. Part of that may have been that when we were first introduced to them, the book seemed to be hinting at Dathan's importance and who was chasing after the family, when we already know that he's a strand cast of Palpatine and the Sith Eternals are chasing after them. We got to see a little bit of Luke's Jedi Temple on Ossus, as well as his relationship with Ben Solo, but there wasn't any major new information that sparked my interest. I was slightly confused, or maybe just disappointed, that after everything Luke learned about the Jedi Order, Luke still wanted to return to the old ways and have no attachment, which made Luke's relationship with Ben, who is his nephew and Padawan, tough to navigate. Lor San Tekka making an appearance got me very excited, because we know that the two of them went on adventures together discovering Jedi lore, but when they went to Yoturba to investigate a dig site, it didn't live up to what I had imagined. Even though I eventually came around on Beaumont King, and was glad we got more details about him, for a while it felt like only a way to connect to Luke and Lore at the site. The broken Sith holocron and kyber crystal shards that were found on the planet interested me at first, but I quickly began to move on and think ahead in the story, not really caring about them at all. In my opinion, Lando's introduction to the reader was the strongest out of any character in this novel. We see him at Box Point Station, which was described to be a very interesting environment. He's still gambling, but we learn that it's become more of a coping mechanism after his daughter, Kadara, was taken 6 years ago, when she was only 2 years old. I was able to really connect with Lando and felt sorry for everything he had gone through since the Empire fell. He became completely hopeless after his search for his daughter ended at a dead end, and it hurt to see such a positive and charming person like Lando so low and depressed. However, when he happens to stumble upon a bar that also hosts Ochi of Bestoon, his luck takes a turn for the better. He learns of Ochi's mission to kidnap a girl for the Sith, and realizes that learning more about this mission might help him find his missing daughter. After this, I was instantly hooked on both Lando and Ochi for the rest of the story. When we met back up with Luke on Tython, it got to a point in the story that I just wasn't as invested anymore. Learning more about the Seeing Stone and its history was neat, but the action during the scene was confusing and dragged on, and Anakin's appearance as a Force ghost felt cheap. It didn't seem to serve a purpose in the story, and I couldn't find a reason why Anakin wouldn't just tell Luke about Exegol and everything there. I was able to forget about it when Lando finally showed back up, but the scene just didn't meet my expectations after what it had been built up to be. When Luke and Lando team up and become sort of a buddy cop duo, that's when I really started to enjoy the story again. My enjoyment for the novel definitely seemed to be based upon whether Lando was currently the focus or not. He had a lot of good moments, and it made me really want to see the teased Lando and Janna story at the end of The Rise of Skywalker. The rest of the story was mostly fine, nothing that stood out as either good or bad. Lando helps the family escape again, but they're found again after dropping Rey off on Jakku. It's something that we already knew happened, but getting to see the parents' reasoning for it and the details of how they worked it out with Unkar Plutt added much more meaning to when we see Rey on Jakku to start The Force Awakens. I also never stopped to think about why Ochi died on Pisana when Rey was left on Jakku, but we learn how her mother's brilliance was able to save her daughter's life. One of the saddest parts of the novel is that Luke and Lando find Rey's parents dead. They assume Ochi has Rey, and because they don't know how he died on Pisana, they never learn what happened until decades later, the entire time thinking that they failed to protect this family from the Sith. Even though I really enjoyed getting to see more of the Sith, the insane amount of mystery surrounding the new Sith character made the character hard to follow or care about. I was intrigued when the new character was introduced on Pandora as someone who wore a mysterious mask and once served the Sith, even though I was never right, because the mask ended up coming from the new Sith Lord Noctis. I had quite a bit of fun speculating throughout the majority of the book about whose mask it was, like maybe Momin's, which we've seen in some of the comics, or Vader's, which somehow made its way off of Endor after Vader is burned. We later learn more about the woman when she confronts Luke. Both her mask and lightsaber were from Darth Noctis and possessed her. The character herself never really grew on me enough, but I enjoyed getting to learn about a new Sith Lord and his background. Even though the new Sith didn't exactly do it for me, one of my favorite parts of the novel was the characterization given to Ochi of Bestoon. A lot of time was taken to introduce him and Dio, as Ochi lives on a remote moon while he searches how to find a way back to Exegol, so that he can heal himself. I've only read the first 2 volumes of the current Darth Vader comic, but there were a lot of connections and references to when Ochi and Vader went to Exegol. I don't think the comic is a necessary read before this book, but it definitely made everything about Ochi easier to understand. And I was already invested in him as a character. For the most part, the character was consistent with what we've already seen from him, with one example of this being his attitude towards Dio. The droid was first seen in The Rise of Skywalker as someone who is abused by his former master, which we see a bit in this novel. The book didn't give a bunch of background on the droid, but I was glad we got to know Dio more than what we saw from the movie. We got to stay with Ochi for a while after he was first introduced, which helped keep the story on track rather than jumping from character to character. He's offered a Sith Wayfinder and the path to Exegol by the Sith Eternal if he can find Rey and bring her to the Emperor, which connects to the character story back in the sequels. We also see when he was given the dagger, which almost became a character of its own as it was described. The Shadow Talk was also a confusing and overly ambiguous way to describe what I assume was Palpatine. Sometimes it worked for me, and sometimes I just didn't care enough, which was the case with a lot of parts of this book. We later see Ochi hunting down Mace Windu and Depa Billaba on Malathon 9 in a short flashback chapter. It came out of nowhere and broke up the present-day story, but my guess is that it was used to establish Ochi's abilities and his hubris, but I just enjoyed getting a flashback to the Clone Wars. Enric Pride also appears for a small moment that felt a bit convenient and just a way to connect more to The Rise of Skywalker, but it was a way to describe the state of the Empire after Jakku, and the character still felt consistent with what we saw previously from him. Because the story is on a much larger scale that spans the entire galaxy, there was mention of the current post-Civil War state of the galaxy, even though it wasn't brought up as much as I would have liked. Often from Lando's perspective, we see how flawed the New Republic is, even after everything people like Lando gave up to defeat the Empire. The galaxy is better in the core, but the majority still have to deal with the dangers and pockets of corruption and tyranny that never disappeared after the Emperor's death. Lando and the other members of the rebellion, who fought for a new way of life, imagined how much better the galaxy would be without the Empire, and the New Republic has its ideals, but reality was much different than expected. We got to see this multiple times throughout the novel, whenever the New Republic made an appearance. When New Republic pilots first saved Rey and her parents from hunters, I wasn't a fan of the characters themselves, but they still served their purpose of showing how the new government was taking on so much and couldn't afford to worry about the space beyond their borders. There were still good people serving, but some decided to just stick to their mandate and not take any more work, even if it was the right thing to do. Even later, when Lando and Luke visited a New Republic outpost, which featured a nice Shriv cameo that got me excited, the two war heroes were barely celebrated. Even though it's been 20 years since the end of the Empire, I expected a former general and Jedi Master to be revered and celebrated. Instead, they were seemingly ignored by everyone and were unable to get any information to help with their mission. Maybe it just showed how quickly everyone wanted to move on from the Imperial era, but I was surprised to see how little of a reaction the two characters got. When this book was first announced, I was very excited to see more Luke post Return of the Jedi, and him and Lando hunting down Ochi seemed like a cool story. However, throughout most of the book, I never felt like there was a reason that this story needed to be told. We already knew for the most part what happened to Rey and her parents, and how Ochi was tasked with bringing the young girl to the Sith Eternal on Exegol. This may have just been in-the-moment cynicism, but I wasn't getting much out of reading the book. It took until almost the very end of the story, when it really started to tie in to the sequel trilogy, like how Rey was left on Jakku and why Ochi was on Pasaana, that I finally started to feel satisfied from reading the book. The story adds much more weight to the entire flashback sequence from the rise of Skywalker, especially the death of Rey's parents, who I had grown quite attached to by the end of the novel. We got to see more about Dathan and what his life on Exegol was like before he was able to escape. I was surprised at how well it connected to the Vader comic where he and Ochi visit Exegol to learn more about what the Emperor had created. Dathan knew that there were visitors and just hid on their ship until they left. This chapter did a lot to help me grow more attached to the character, since I wasn't particularly enjoying him as an adult. The chapter also mentioned multiple Sith names, including Plagueis, Revan, Noctis, Sanguis, Kakon, Vord, and Shah. The droid Crush also made a few appearances during the story, which I never really cared about, but it was more connective tissue to the other Ochi stories. I enjoyed a lot of the connections to the Darth Vader comic, but it got to a point where it felt like too much, and it might have been better if other stories were mentioned as well. One of the things this novel did was get me excited to rewatch The Rise of Skywalker, and the sequels in general. What we see from Rey, Lando, and Ochi all has more meaning and depth to it after reading this, and there were also a lot of connections throughout the book. Some were handled better than others, but it's always fun to see a familiar name or planet mentioned. Unkar Plutt and Pasaana were both mentioned, and then later got more of the spotlight. No matter what kind of Star Wars book you like, I think everyone can find something to enjoy in this novel. Whether it be fleshing out the era, the focus on Sith and the Force, or just seeing some familiar characters again in the major story. However, if you prefer books on a grand scale that tell a complex and intricate story, rather than one that goes in depth on every character, then this is a must-read. There's a complete cast of characters that all have their own background and story, which cross paths more often than they would prefer. It jumps across both the galaxy and the timeline, giving the reader background information on multiple characters, both familiar and new. The grand story presented in Shadow of the Sith is written in a way that may not be for everyone, but it does an excellent job at connecting to established stories and developing a previously unknown period of time in the galaxy, earning a rating of 8 out of 10. Let me know what you thought of Shadow of the Sith in the comments below, or if you'll be picking it up after this. Remember to like the video, and subscribe for more in-depth reviews like this, as well as news stories, Star Wars lore, gaming videos, and more. As always, thank you all for watching, and remember, the Force will be with you, always.